A boost to the economic forecast since March put billions in the Chancellor's pockets, and he decided to splash half of that on spending.
As a result of this spending review, and contrary to speculation, there will be a real terms rise in overall spending for every single department, and public sector net investment as a share of GDP will be at the highest sustained level for nearly half a century. If anybody still doubts it, today's budget confirms the Conservatives are the real party of public services.
Rishi Sunak repeatedly boasted some spending would be back to the levels enjoyed before George Osborne's years of austerity. But he tried to reassure traditionalists that the Tory party hadn't lost its moorings.
Do we choose to recognise that government has limits? Government should have limits. If this seems a controversial statement to make, then I'm all the more glad for saying it, because that means it needed saying, and it is what we believe.
After much self-promotion, no shortage of teasers.
It's about building that stronger economy, that stronger set of public finances.
In the end, chunks of this budget and spending round ended up sounding much more like the work of his Downing Street neighbour.
We are increasing skills spending over the Parliament by £3.8 billion, an extra £2.2 billion for courts, prisons and probation services. Just under £2 billion of new funding. Restore per pupil funding to 2010 levels in real terms.
Rishi Sunak definitely wants you to know that he's not George Osborne. He's at pains to point out that he's reversing some of the cuts that have taken place since 2010. The only similarity is that both of them are attached to the public finances being brought back into balance on a fairly fast timetable over the course of the next 3 years. But Rishi Sunak is doing it through tax rises, and George Osborne did it through spending cuts.
Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak visited a brewery to promote the tax reform on alcohol duties, which will reduce duty on some draft beers in pubs and on some English wines.
Do you want us to puff and strain a bit more?
On the eve of the COP26 climate change conference, tax on internal UK flights was trimmed and petrol duty frozen yet again. But the Chancellor also responded to the pressure to ease the pain inflicted on universal credit recipients, who had the £20 a week uplift granted at the beginning of the pandemic completely withdrawn earlier this month. He cut the taper rate at which those in work lose their universal credit as their earnings increase.
To make sure work pays and help some of the lowest income families in our country keep more of their hard-earned money, I have decided to cut this rate, not by 1%, not by 2%, but by 8%.
I was absolutely gutted this morning to test positive for COVID.
The Labour leader suddenly had to leave Parliament and isolate, just as he was due to give the traditional leader of the opposition response to the budget. Yeah! His shadow chancellor stood in and condemned the universal credit changes as way too little.
The arrogance after taking £6 billion out of the pockets of some of the poorest people in this country, expecting them to cheer today for £2 billion given to compensate.
The Chancellor said Britain was on track for the high-wage future the Prime Minister promised, but the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility analysis suggests inflation could make real wages a lot leaner for many.
The OBR's projections are for barely any income growth over the next 4 or 5 years. I'm afraid for most of us it's not going to feel great. Some people will get nice big pay rises because there are shortages in their areas, but I'm afraid some on the other end will not be keeping up with inflation.
And I commend it to the House.
Tory MPs cheered the spending spree, but Rishi Sunak felt it necessary tonight to yet again reassure them, this time in a private meeting, that his heart truly beats faster for tax cuts, not spending, just in case they'd got the wrong idea today.
Well, talking to some Tory MPs who were in that meeting and were listening to the budget earlier, it's very interesting. They come away with the impression that Rishi Sunak is saying to them, sure, I got the money to spend this time out of a windfall. If I got another one, trust me, I'd give it to tax cuts. They're wondering, well, what does a low tax Tory economy look like anymore? Where is the level of that tax? You get different responses depending on different MPs you talk to. One Redwall MP I spoke to was grinning from ear to ear. He felt that the speech gave him almost every paragraph of it, he said. Another leaflet I could write to hold my seat. Traditional Tories, as you might call them, that you talk to, a bit worried about the spending, some of them will say to you, even though I spotted some of the very same ones waving order papers in the pictures. They say, actually, will you be able to raise the sort of tax levels on which this spending is floating? Theresa May raised that sort of point in the House of Commons earlier. One last thing about the spending, an awful lot of it has been brought forward into earlier years, different columns, and that's made a lot of people who were thinking about a 2023 general election being a possibility raise their hopes and, depending on which side of the argument you're on, their fears that that might just be something that happens.
Gary, thanks very much. Well, for more on the details of what Rishi Sunak has promised and what it says about the future of the UK economy, our economics correspondent Helia Ebrahimi is with me. So are the Conservatives the big spenders now then, Helia?
Well, Cathy, here's a chancellor who keeps wanting to persuade us what an enthusiastic Thatcherite he is. But under his watch, the tax burden has gone up to levels we've not seen since the 1950s, and public spending is roughly half of national income. That's the kind of level we haven't seen since his pin-up, Mrs. Thatcher, rolled back the size of the state in the 1980s. So how did we get all of this spending? Well, first, the OBR economic forecasts are much better than they were in spring. They're better in terms of unemployment, better in terms of growth, better in terms of borrowing, and critically, in terms of that long-term scarring caused by the pandemic. And you can see that in terms of the deficit, because in every single year of the forecast, borrowing now looks better. And across the period, it's better to the tune of £150 billion. That gives him a bit of wriggle room, Cathy. The other source of his windfall are his own tax rises. National insurance hike, you had corporation tax going up, as well as freezing income thresholds. Together, these measures represent the biggest burden on UK population since really Clement Attlee's government back in the 1950s, all the way back to that line there. And critically, you know, this is very important. Together with those announcements, you've got the idea of, has austerity disappeared completely? You know, a lot of the times where we've seen spending increase, all of that money has been swallowed up by the NHS, with unloved departments like local government, like prisons, still reeling from austerity. Today, the big surprise has been that all government departments have had a real-term spending increase. Across the board, that's meant that spending is going up now by 3.8%. That's the column right at the end. That's a far cry, as Gary was saying, from the Osborne years you can see in blue and orange. It's much more similar to those red columns, which are the Blair-Brown years, yet another Labour government comparison for Mr. Sunak.
So is this a feel-good budget? I'm thinking about the booze stuff, for example.
Well, you've got the Chancellor talking about this new age of optimism, but it's set against a really difficult backdrop of spiralling inflation. And for all of the policy measures that you've heard, the cost of living crisis is real. And you can see that in the OBR forecast about household incomes, which are basically stagnating for years under the increase of prices. So you can see the Chancellor trying to ameliorate that squeeze on incomes. I mean, overall, Cathy, you know, perhaps in a more Thatcherite Milton Friedman dream, the Chancellor would have used all of his windfall from the OBR to pay down borrowing. But he doesn't do that. He spends more than half, on government departments, on public spending. So it doesn't quite sound like the ideological stance against a bigger state.
Well, perhaps he'll reinstate those Thatcherite credentials closer to that election that Gary was talking about. Thanks, Helia.